Rome slept, but the palace never truly did. Beneath its marble ceilings and gilded columns, where senators bowed and slaves scattered rose petals across cold floors, a woman waited for the moon to rise so she could disappear. She was the wife of an emperor, the mother of his children, the most powerful woman in the known world. And yet, when darkness fell thick enough to swallow torchlight, she would slip a wig over her dark hair, wrap herself in a coarse cloak meant for beggars, and vanish through a door that history says led straight into the underworld of the city she secretly ruled. Her name was Messalina, and what she did in the shadows of Rome would echo through 2,000 years of scandal, disbelief, and dread. Because power, real power, is never satisfied with thrones. It hungers for something rawer, something forbidden, something that no crown could ever give her. Tonight we opened the doors she tried so desperately to keep locked. To understand how an empress ended up walking barefoot through Rome's filthiest alleys, you first have to understand the golden cage she was born into. Valeria Messalina was barely a teenager when she was married off to Claudius, a man twice her age, awkward, stammering, mocked by his own family for a lifetime, suddenly thrust onto the throne of the Roman Empire after the assassination of Caligula. Overnight, the girl who had grown up in the shadow of emperors became one of the most watched women alive. She bore him children. She stood beside him at ceremonies. She wore the jewels, the silk, the perfume of absolute power. But behind the poised expression Rome saw in public, something else was forming. A hunger the palace could not feed her. A restlessness that history's harshest chroniclers would later claim burned hotter than any fire in the empire. Tacitus wrote of her with a kind of horrified fascination. Juvenal turned her into a symbol of insatiable desire. Pliny the Elder recorded a claim so audacious that even now scholars still argue over whether to believe it. And it is this claim, whispered, exaggerated, perhaps embellished by men who feared powerful women, that forms the dark, glittering center of her legend. According to Pliny, Messalina once entered a contest against Rome's most notorious prostitute and won, not through wealth or status, but through sheer, exhausting stamina, working through the night while the professional collapsed from fatigue. Whether the story is fact or Roman gossip sharpened into myth, it captures something undeniable about how Rome saw her, not merely as unfaithful, but as a woman who had broken every rule of what an empress was allowed to want, and the palace itself could not contain her. Ancient sources claim she had a private cell built inside the imperial residence, disguised under a false name, so she could receive lovers without stepping outside the walls that were supposed to protect her reputation. But even that wasn't enough. The real danger, the real thrill, wasn't behind palace doors. It was out there, in the smoke-filled taverns, the flickering brothels lit by oil lamps, where nobody knew her face, where nobody bowed, where for a few stolen hours she could simply be a woman instead of an empire's most valuable possession. Picture it. The sun sinks below Rome's 7 hills. Guards change their posts along marble corridors, unaware that the empress has already slipped past them wearing a wig the color of straw, her fine linen traded for the rough wool of a common woman. She moves through servant passages built for slaves, not empresses. Her sandals replaced with something quieter, something that won't echo against stone. Outside, the city breathes differently at night. The Suburra district comes alive with a chaos the palace could never replicate. Shouting merchants, drunken soldiers, the low murmur of transactions no senator would ever admit to witnessing. Suetonius claims she took the name Lysiska for these nights, a name meaning she-wolf, chosen, some historians suggest, almost as a private joke, an admission of exactly what she'd become once the palace gates closed behind her. In that alleyway, in that borrowed identity, the most powerful woman in Rome became untouchable in a different way. Not through legions, not through law, through invisibility. But invisibility, no matter how carefully constructed, is fragile. Word began to move through Rome, the way smoke moves through a locked room. Slow, then suddenly everywhere. Slaves whispered. Guards exchanged uneasy glances. Senators who despised Claudius saw an opportunity forming in the shadows of his wife's secret. Ancient historians claim Messalina grew bolder, not more cautious, as if the risk itself had become part of the addiction. She allegedly staged a mock wedding to one of her lovers, Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away. An act so reckless, so publicly damning, that even her allies could no longer explain it away as rumor, whether this was political ambition, genuine infatuation, or the final collapse of a woman who had spent years testing how far she could push the boundaries of her own power. The effect was the same. It lit the fuse that would end everything, because in Rome, an empress could survive scandal, she could survive gossip, even proof. What she could not survive was making Claudius look like a fool in front of the entire empire he supposedly commanded. When the news finally reached Claudius, and delivered, some sources say, by his own advisors who feared for their lives if they stayed silent, the palace fell into a silence far more dangerous than any nighttime alley Messalina had ever walked through. This was not jealousy. This was treason dressed in the shape of a marriage. Freedmen surrounding the emperor, men whose entire survival depended on Claudius remaining in power, moved with terrifying speed. They didn't wait for imperial hesitation. They didn't wait for mercy. Soldiers were dispatched before Claudius could fully process what his own wife had done, arriving at the gardens where Messalina had reportedly fled, hoping, perhaps, that her husband's famous slowness to act would save her one final time. It didn't. The order came quickly, coldly, without the emperor even present to deliver it himself. And in that moment, the woman who had once vanished into Rome's streets by choice now had nowhere left to run at all. What happened next is one of history's quieter horrors. Not a public execution staged for spectacle, but something almost clinical in its brutality. A soldier arrived, sword drawn, standing over the Empress in her final moments. And according to the ancient accounts, even Messalina, the woman who had defied convention, who had built entire secret identities to escape the walls of her own life, could not find the courage to end things herself when handed the blade. The soldier finished what she couldn't. When Claudius was informed, historians tell us he showed almost no reaction at all. A chilling, hollow response for a marriage that had produced children, scandal, and now silence. Her name was ordered erased. Statues that once bore her likeness were destroyed. Rome, ever practical about its embarrassments, moved to make it seem as though Valeria Messalina had never truly existed at all. But erasure has never worked on stories this dangerous. Not fully, not permanently. Nearly 2,000 years later, we are still speaking her name, still arguing over which parts of her legend were truth, and which were the poisoned ink of historians who despise powerful women and punished them the only way they knew how, through infamy. Maybe Messalina was exactly what Rome's harshest critics claimed. Reckless, insatiable, drunk on the one kind of freedom her marriage could never give her. Or maybe she was something far more human and far more tragic. A teenage girl handed to an empire before she understood what she was losing, who spent her adult life trying to reclaim some sliver of choice in a world that had never once asked what she wanted. Either way, the palace walls that were built to protect her ended up being the very thing she risked everything to escape. And perhaps that's the coldest truth buried in her story, that even absolute power, even a crown, even an empire at your feet cannot always fill the hollow space where freedom is supposed to live. History buried her. Tonight, we brought her back. She wore a crown by day, yours in a stranger's face by night. In the end, both masks failed her. Messalina's story was never just about scandal. It was about what happens when power forgets it's still human. Because behind every empire, there's a person still searching for something no throne could ever offer. Freedom, silence, a version of themselves nobody controls. If this story kept you here till the last second, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because history buried this once. We won't let it stay buried again.